Oh, so you want to be a photographer, but you don't know where to start? Well, I'm gonna give you a couple tips that I've learned along the way to become what you want to be. Let's go. Why do you want to be a photographer? Obviously, there's a whole bunch of reasons, and so go buy a camera and start shooting. So the first thing you're gonna have to deal with is getting a camera. What you want it for, because obviously that'll relate back to why do you want to be a photographer. So there's a few different types of cameras that you can get. So I'm going to cover about 2 different types of cameras with 2 subcategories, I guess you can say. We have DSLRs and we have mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless like this is all the craze right now because they're a lot lighter package and they can give you all the things that a DSLR can give you. The difference between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera is what the mirrorless name says. It's a mirrorless, so the image goes directly through the lens into the sensor. And on a DSLR, which has a mirror, the image comes in through the lens, bounces off of a couple mirrors, and then into the sensor. They just cut out the middleman and then compacted the package to make it even lighter and easier to use, which is the reason why I got the camera that I got. Now, the Canon M50. I used to have the Canon 7D Mark II, which is a pretty big camera, especially with the battery pack on it, all the accessories and stuff. So I was getting tired of that and wanted to downgrade, but in reality, I wasn't really downgrading. I was just swapping. Yeah, back to the cameras. Okay, so those are the differences between DSLR and mirrorless for the most part, the main parts. And then now we're going to go into full frame versus crop sensor. So full frame camera is pretty much a viewing field of about 35 millimeters. It's kind of relevant to the human eye of how much we can actually see. APS-C sensor, crop sensor is cropped in, so the full image is smaller than what you are trying to see, so you can either get a wide angle lens or move back. So with the crop sensor, you have a 1.6 times crop. So say you have a 35 millimeter lens, you have a crop sensor camera, put the 35 millimeter lens on there, and then you're gonna have to times it by 1.6. That 35 millimeter lens becomes a 56 millimeter lens. Around 50 millimeters is good for portraits. There are some adapters out there, like for my mirrorless camera. From my 7D, I was able to use APS-C lenses as well as full frame lenses without any problem. I still had the crop factor, but there was no problem with the camera being able to handle those lenses. But with the mirrorless camera, they have their own adapter. So in order to be able to use the old lenses for DSLRs, you need an adapter. And that adapter adds an additional crop factor. And when you buy it, it'll have in the description like what the crop factor is. And then also like for right here, I don't know if you can hear. So with this speed booster adapter, it not only allows you to use the lenses that you've already had, but it gets rid of a lot of the crop factor because it's I think the lens inside, the piece of glass inside is kind of concave, so it expands a little bit and makes my 50 millimeter closer to an actual 50 millimeter than if I just have the normal adapter on. My 50 becomes closer to an 80. So with the full frame camera, you'll get closer to the actual focal length of the lens than you would with the APS-C sensor or the crop sensor. So a 35 mil will be a 35 mil as opposed to a 35 mil having to have the crop factor of 1.6 plus speed adapter, speed booster, adapter, making it closer to 50 to 80. The budget regarding those cameras, obviously the full frame is going to be a lot more and crop sensor will be a lot less. So that is a factor, but there's only a couple of areas of photography that you will need a full frame camera, such as wedding photography, real estate photography. Those need the full frame. So now that you have your camera, you don't want to shoot in auto. You don't want to shoot in auto and call yourself a photographer. Otherwise, you're just taking pictures. You're not making photos. You're not creating art. You're just taking pictures. And why get a camera to take pictures when you have a phone that can do all that? So what you want to do is learn the holy trinity of photography. And the holy trinity all deals with how much light your sensor is going to get through 3 settings: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And how I'm going to explain this to you is hopefully being able to relate this to your eye, your sight, because that's pretty much what a camera is imitating. Let's start with the simple thing, shutter speed. So the shutter speed on the camera will be 1/60 or 1/100. That's the shutter speed. That's the shutter speed option that you have. And what I relate to shutter speed is how fast you blink. So the faster you blink, the less light you're gonna get. The slower you blink, the more light you're gonna get, obviously. So let's say you're in a situation where you're outside and it's really bright and you take a picture at like 1/100 and it's like nothing, it's all just white. You're like, oh shit, I need to speed up my shutter speed so I'm not capturing so much light. And so you turn up your shutter speed to maybe like 1/500. So that's how fast it's gonna clip. And then when you click it, obviously more of the image is gonna come out because it's not being so blown out by how much light your sensor is being allowed to capture. Another scenario, let's say you're shooting at night. You have that 1/500 shutter speed. Everything's gonna be black because you're not allowing enough ambient light at night, which is the type of light that you're gonna get at night. You're not allowing that light to come into the sensor. You're shutting it off really quick. So it's just like, nope, no light for me. And you don't want to do that. So you're gonna have to lower your shutter speed. This is negating the other settings for right now, just so you understand shutter speed. But you slow it down. So let's say it's like, you can make your shutter speed maybe 30 seconds. So your shutter will click and it's open the whole time for 30 seconds. And whatever light is out will just add on to that sensor. An example is if you've ever seen a photo of light streaks like that, it's from a long exposure shot, which has like a 30-second or 10-second, shutter speed. And what that allows you to do is be mobile. Like say you turn on your light. The motion of my camera will be recorded because that's the light shining directly to the sensor. Me, myself, since I am not emitting light, will not show up in that photo. So you will just be seeing this streak of light go back and forth, but you won't see me because I'm moving and I'm not emitting light. So yeah, that's shutter speed. Let's jump into aperture. Aperture, it's like your pupil. So when you open your aperture, your pupil gets big, and when you close it, it gets small. So that's what it is, and that's another way to add more light. So the aperture is the f-stop. Aperture and f-stop are interchangeable. They both mean the same thing. And what it is, just like I said, it's like your pupil. It's dilating the actual lens to allow more light in or less light in. So obviously the smaller your aperture is, the less light you're gonna get. The wider it is, the more light you're gonna get. Like I was saying, the shutter speed, aperture, and then the ISO, they all dictate how much light your sensor is going to receive, and how much light your sensor gets is going to show you what your image is going to look like. So, and with the bigger aperture, it's a side effect, I guess you can say. The bigger aperture you have, the more bokeh, the more background blur you're gonna get. So the focal depth is going to be a lot less. Let's say you're a portrait photographer. You want to take a crispy photo of something in the foreground or in the midground or in the background, and you want everything else to be blurred. That's when you would go to your f-stop, drop it down to like a 1 point something up to like a 2 point something, pushing it, and that'll give you the subject in focus and everything blurred. But let's say you have family that you want to photograph, or a landscape or something like that. You want your f-stop number to be a lot bigger, so more is in focus. So the focal length, the focal depth isn't as precise. It'll kind of flatten the image as far as focus. So that's just another tip of aperture. ISO is the next thing we'll get. ISO doesn't really relate to your eye or how it functions, from what I've gathered. What ISO is artificial light. So it's like turning on a light switch. It's digital lightening or darkening of the image that you're about to take. So let's say, all your other settings are good, but for whatever reason, you're in a situation where you're not getting enough light still based off of your settings. That's when ISO can come into play. You add your ISO, you lift it up, or you raise the number up, and it'll brighten your image, brighten your image, brighten your image. which sounds nice, right? But on the flip side, the side effect of that is you're gonna introduce a lot more noise into your photo, a lot more grain. And depending on your camera and the situations will dictate like how high you can go within your ISO number before it starts to compromise the composition or the quality of the photo. So all this, you're gonna learn while you're doing it. So obviously you don't want to get your camera, learn all this stuff and then implement it on the shoot that you're going to. You want to implement that before, so you're not stuck in the middle of a shoot and you're kind of stressing. I've done that and it's not fun, because it's like you can't show the person or the client that it's not going the way you want it to go, because they're gonna lose confidence in you. And that's one of the last things you want to deal with, is your customer or your client not having confidence in your ability, because they came to you for a reason. So make sure you know what you're doing. All right, so now that we got the Holy Trinity out the way, and we got what type of camera you want out the way, let's get into finding your style, your eye, your creativity. A couple things you can do. The main thing is look at other examples. Obviously you want to be a photographer because you've seen some dope photos. You've seen what people can do. Obviously you want to continue to do that, continue to look at different photographers, their work, watch movies, watch TV, not just for the entertainment value, but see how they're producing it, see how many camera angles they use, see what type of shot resonates with you to want to recreate with somebody or something else. Understand the composition of that particular shot, of that photo, of that scene, and understand how it came to be. There's the rule of thirds, the golden mean, and then there's what I mentioned before with the aperture. There's bokeh, blurry background, everything like that. So just research those things and it'll help your eye figure out what you're shooting when you're shooting it. So you're not just like, oh, let me just take a picture of this because I think it looks cool. Compose that picture, If you need to get down to a different angle, if you need them to move slightly or something like that, just to, hit those rules, it'll make your composition look a lot better. A lot of people get into photography and they don't know what they're actually capable of because they haven't been exposed to everything. So the more you expose yourself to different types of photography, different creative outlets, it'll help you in the long run develop your own preferences and skill sets. All right, so you got your camera, you got your inspo, you did all this stuff, you figured out the rule of thirds, the golden mean, yada, 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 and now you have this memory card full of photos and you don't know what to do with it. Editing. The two main aspects of photography is taking the photo and then editing the photo. So you're gonna need some type of computer, laptop, tablet that can handle editing programs. I know like on the iPad, Lightroom is free. There is a subscription one that you can get, but you can edit all your photos in these apps on your iPad or your phone. Another thing is obviously using your computer. So the main editing softwares that I'm familiar with is Lightroom, Photoshop. I've heard of Capture One, but I've never used it, and GIMP. Let's jump into what Photoshop is, because everyone knows what Photoshop is, but not everyone knows what Lightroom is. I remember when I first started photography, I had not heard of Lightroom at all. I just knew Photoshop. This was like 5, 6, 7 years ago. I was taking these photos and then editing the light values in Photoshop, and it just got so tedious. I was like, man, I wish there was a program out there that I can edit multiple photos at a time. I forgot how I learned this, but I figured out Lightroom is actually the program that you want to use for those types of that type of editing. Like Photoshop does the heavy lifting. Lightroom pretty much gives you the option to edit multiple photos, but not really get too in depth. So you can do like shadows, exposure, light, blacks and whites, color grading and stuff like that. That's what I use Lightroom for, and then I take those photos that I've picked and edited in Lightroom, throw them into Photoshop, use the heal tool, do some skin touch-ups, whatever, different tools to do different things within Photoshop. Photoshop is like what you use to really clean up everything. Lightroom just does the lighting. Yeah, those are the two main things. And if you want to get really creative, you can also use Photoshop. Take out backgrounds, replace anything. All right, so this was like a basic crash course of things to consider, things you got to do, things to learn while wanting to be a photographer. Obviously, let's recap: finding out why you want to be a photographer, what type of shoots you want to do, figuring out what camera is best for you, budget wise, as well as, again, what you're trying to do, understanding and learning the holy trinity of photography, and it all relates to how much light is coming into the sensor to capture what you're doing. Shutter speed is like how fast you blink, aperture is like how big and small your pupils are, and ISO is like artificial light, adding light, turning on the light switch, turning it off. Developing your creative eye, looking at examples, reaching out to other photographers, watching movies, watching TV shows, and looking beyond the actual show into the production of the show, because everything that you watch is produced by people like you, creative people that have an eye for this. Because as a photographer, as a videographer, to get people to see your stuff is to make your stuff visually appealing. This is something you gotta practice. And after you have all that, you got your pictures produced or whatever, you go in to edit them. You edit your stuff. You know, that's where you're gonna develop your editing style. Shooting style and editing styles are different. I've had people say, "Was this your photo?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I can see how you shot it, because that's your style." I have more photography style than I do an editing style, because personally I don't enjoy editing as much as I enjoy shooting. Anyway, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I'm gonna be making more videos of this type of stuff. Johnny B the Shooter becomes Johnny B the Tutor. And the next video is going to be about videography, video work. And then I'll probably teach you guys how to rap. Till next time, subscribe, like, comment below, JohnnyBTheShooter.com.